Right. So today we are taking a deep dive into this fascinating conversation that happened between these two really well-known media personalities.
Yeah.
And they were, of all places, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Interesting setting.
Super interesting setting.
For sure.
Like what brings these two together.
Right.
And I'll tell you what brings them together.
Okay.
Is controversy.
Oh, boy.
So, yeah, they...
lay it on me.
Right out of the gate, they start debating about the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Okay.
And one of them actually uses this term to describe him that like right away sparks a debate.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So tell me more.
The word is dictator.
Woo!
Yeah.
So
you can imagine how that kind of plays out.
I can only imagine. Yeah. So how does that go?
Well, one of them is saying that Zelensky is a dictator because he shut down a specific religious group in Ukraine.
Okay.
And then silenced some of his political opponents.
Okay, so they're using those actions as proof.
As proof that he's a dictator.
And what does the other speaker say to that?
Well, the other one is arguing that Zelensky's actions were justified given that Russia invaded the country.
Okay, so they're saying in a time of war, you got to do what you got to do.
Exactly. And they get into this whole thing about the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Oh, right.
And one of the speakers argues that the war has become a stalemate.
Oh, wow.
With like thousands of people dead on both sides. And there's really no clear winner at this point.
So just senseless death and destruction.
Yeah, they're questioning whether either side is really winning this war.
Yeah. A lot of wars end up that way, unfortunately, where no one really wins.
And then it gets really interesting because one of them questions the very existence of NATO.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, they're basically saying that NATO might have actually caused the conflict.
Okay, hold on. I gotta hear this. How are they making that argument?
Okay, so they're saying that NATO's expansion eastward and this like potential inclusion of Ukraine was basically a direct threat to Russia.
So Russia felt threatened.
Yeah, they felt cornered.
Okay.
And they're saying that's what provoked Putin to invade Ukraine.
Interesting. So they're saying NATO pushed Russia too far.
Exactly. Like they poked the bear one too many times.
Well, I see.
And then they get into Crimea.
Oh, boy. Yeah, Crimea, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is.
Yeah.
And, you know, it has this long, complicated history with Russia.
Right.
And they discuss this disputed referendum that happened.
Yeah.
That led to Russia annexing Crimea back in 2014.
Yeah. Complicated situation, for sure.
And one of the speakers is saying that it was just this blatant land grab by Russia. Right. You know, a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Right. A lot of people saw it that way as just straight up aggression.
But then the other speaker brings up the fact that there's always been this very strong Russian presence in Crimea.
Right. Historically. Yeah. Crimea has had close ties to Russia.
And they talk about the results of the referendum.
Yeah.
Which, at least on the surface, showed that a majority of people living there actually wanted to be a part of Russia.
Okay. So they're bringing in the perspective of the people living there and their right to self-determination.
Exactly. So they're saying even if it was messy, there's this argument to be made that the people of Crimea had a right to choose.
It's a very complex issue.
Arguments on both sides.
And then they go from there to talking about nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this is where I was really surprised by one of the speakers.
Okay. What did they say?
So they basically said that it's good that Great Britain has nuclear weapons.
Really?
Yeah.
But they're worried about other countries having them.
Well, yeah.
Interesting.
So it seems kind of contradictory.
It does on the surface.
But it all comes back to this idea of nuclear deterrence.
Right. The idea that if you have nukes, other countries are less likely to attack you.
Because they're afraid of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction.
Right. So they're basically saying that Great Britain having nukes actually keeps things stable.
It's a scary logic, but I can see how they'd arrive at that conclusion. It's like a necessary evil in their eyes.
And they talk about how they're terrified of nuclear proliferation.
Right, because the more countries that have these weapons, the higher the chances of them actually being used.
Right, which would obviously be catastrophic.
Absolutely a nightmare scenario.
Okay, so next they get into this debate about foreign aid.
Okay.
Specifically, the U.S. giving military support to Israel.
Right.
In its conflict with Hamas.
Yeah, that's always a contentious issue.
It is. And one speaker argues that supporting Israel is a moral obligation.
Okay.
particularly for the U.S., given their close alliance.
So they see it as a matter of loyalty and principle.
Exact.
To stand by your allies.
But then the other speaker really pushes back, and they question whether America should even be involved in conflicts that are so far away.
Especially conflicts with such a long history.
Yeah. And they bring up the loss of life.
Of course.
And especially the civilian casualties that often happen as a result of military intervention.
So they're questioning the human cost of these interventions.
Yeah, and they're asking this really tough question.
What's that?
Is it always right to back your allies?
Okay.
Even when it comes at such a high cost?
That's the dilemma, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to balance your national interests with your moral obligations.
And they don't really offer any easy answers.
Those are the toughest questions, the ones with no easy answers.
It's about wrestling with these complex ethical dilemmas of foreign policy.
Absolutely.
When is it okay to intervene?
Right.
How do you weigh those national interests against those moral considerations?
That's a constant struggle.
And then here's where things get really interesting, because they actually find some common ground.
Oh, really?
On what they both express concern about immigration.
That's interesting.
And how it's impacting their own countries.
Okay, but how do they arrive at that shared concern?
Okay, so one of them is coming at it from this perspective of cultural change.
Oh.
They're worried about the potential erosion of their nation's identity.
Right.
And the possibility of social unrest.
So for them, it's about preserving a certain way of life.
Exactly.
Protecting their cultural heritage.
Yeah. And the other speaker is more concerned about safety and security.
Okay.
They're linking immigration to an increase in crime.
Right.
And they suggest that it's eroding social cohesion.
So they're worried about the impact on social order.
Right. And both of them are basically saying that immigration brings with it this loss of control.
I see.
Whether it's cultural control or control over safety.
So even though they're coming from different angles, they share this anxiety about loss of control.
Exactly. And that's what unites them on this issue.
Interesting how they can find common ground on such a complex issue, despite disagreeing on so much else.
Yeah, but hold on, because their agreement doesn't last very long.
What happens next?
The next thing you know, they're going head to head over gun control.
Oh, boy.
And it gets pretty heated.
Okay. Tell me more. I'm hooked.
One of them is just this staunch advocate for gun rights.
Okay.
They argue that self-defense is a fundamental right.
Right.
And they come from a culture where gun ownership is just deeply ingrained.
Right.
Almost a part of their national identity.
So for them, it's about individual liberty.
Yeah.
The right to protect oneself.
But the other speaker is horrified by the level of gun violence.
Understandably.
Particularly mass shootings.
Right.
And they just argue that this easy access to firearms is simply not worth the cost in human life.
So they're prioritizing societal safety over individual rights in this case.
And this is where their different cultural backgrounds really clash.
Right. They're coming at this issue from completely different perspectives.
Totally different lenses.
Yeah, one emphasizing individual freedom, the other societal well-being.
And then they go from gun control straight into the world of mental health.
Wow. Okay.
And specifically, the use of SSRI medications.
Okay. This is getting interesting.
So one of them suggests that SSRIs could actually be playing a role.
In what?
In societal problems. Like those mass shootings that we were just talking about.
So they're drawing a connection between SSRIs and these acts of violence.
They express concern about the potential side effects.
Yeah, some SSRIs have been linked to increased aggression in some cases.
But the other speaker pushes back.
Okay.
And they argue that this is a dangerous oversimplification.
So they're saying it's not fair to blame medication for these complex societal issues.
Exactly. And they emphasize personal responsibility.
Okay. So they're shifting the focus back to the individual.
Yeah. They're suggesting that individuals need to take ownership of their actions and focus on survival.
Instead of looking for external explanations.
Right.
Interesting.
And then they go off on this tangent about the British monarchy.
Really?
And what they see as the decline of Christianity in Great Britain.
Wow. Okay. That seems like a bit of a jump.
It does, but it actually ties into this theme that's been woven throughout their whole conversation.
What's that?
This sense of unease about where Western society is headed.
Right, like a feeling that things are unraveling.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see how that connects.
So one of them is lamenting this weakening of the monarchy.
Okay.
They see it as a symbol of national unity and a bygone era.
Okay.
And they also link the decline of Christianity to this loss of moral guidance, which they believe is contributing to societal decay.
So they're mourning the loss of traditional values and institutions.
Exactly.
And they see that as a root cause of societal problems.
Yeah, they're longing for a simpler time.
Yeah.
When things felt more stable and certain.
Right. A time when those traditional structures provided a sense of order and meaning. It's a common sentiment these days.
It is.
This nostalgia for a lost past.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, boy.
We'll be right back with part 2 of this deep dive.
Can't wait.
Where we unpack even more of their controversial opinions.
I'm ready for it.
Okay, so we left off with this sense of unease about the state of Western society, right?
Right. This feeling that things are sort of falling apart.
Unraveling.
Yeah.
And it gets even more intense because they then bring up this concern about declining birth rates.
Oh, wow.
Specifically in Western countries.
Okay.
And they both see it as a sign of something.
Like a canary in the coal mine.
Exactly.
What are they worried about?
Well, one of them argues that it's a natural consequence of economic and social progress.
Okay.
Like as societies become more advanced, people tend to have fewer children.
Makes sense, I guess, when you have more opportunities and resources.
You don't need as many kids.
Right.
But the other speaker is suspicious. They think there might be something more deliberate going on.
Like what?
They suggest that there might be forces at play that are intentionally trying to reduce the population.
Okay, so they're suggesting some kind of conspiracy or a plan?
Yeah, like almost like a form of social engineering.
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation. So are they naming names? Are they saying who they think is behind this?
They don't get into specifics.
Okay.
But they do point to certain policies.
Like what?
That they believe encourage people to have smaller families.
Interesting.
So things like access to contraception and abortion.
Okay, so they see those as tools of population control.
Yeah. And they also talk about what they see as attacks on the traditional family structure.
Okay, so they're connecting this to a broader cultural shift.
Exactly.
Away from traditional values.
Okay, so let's set aside the population question for a minute.
Okay.
And focus on the agriculture piece.
Okay.
What are they saying is actually undermining food production?
So they bring up a whole bunch of issues. Yeah.
One of them is very concerned about policies that restrict farming practices.
Okay.
Things like limiting the use of fertilizers and pesticides.
Right.
Or promoting organic farming.
So like environmental regulations.
Exactly. Right. And they argue that these policies, while well-intentioned, are actually driving down crop yields.
So less food.
Less food.
Okay.
And they're saying that it's making food more expensive.
Right, because it costs more to produce.
Exactly.
And they're concerned that this is ultimately going to hurt the people who can least afford it.
Yeah, it's like a regressive tax. Yeah. Where the poorest people end up paying the highest price.
The other speaker is worried about the consolidation of the agricultural industry.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So they're talking about the rise of these giant agribusinesses that control vast amounts of farmland.
Right, so fewer and fewer companies controlling more and more of our food supply.
Exactly, and they see this
along with the increasing reliance on industrial farming methods and genetically modified crops as making our food systems more vulnerable in the long run.
So they're worried about the resilience of our food system if something goes wrong.
Right. Like what happens if there's a major drought or a disease outbreak or some kind of global conflict?
It's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Right. And they're concerned that we're becoming too reliant on these large-scale industrial systems.
Right. Which are very efficient, but also very fragile.
Exactly.
It's a trade-off.
So it's like they're both worried about the future of food.
Yeah.
But they're coming at it from these very different angles.
Right. One is worried about government overreach. Yeah. The other is worried about corporate power.
Exactly. And their views on GMOs really highlight this divide.
Okay. So what do they say about GMOs?
So one of them is deeply skeptical of GMOs.
Okay.
They argue that we just don't know the long-term effects that they might have on human health and the environment.
Yeah, that's a common concern.
And they see it as this risky experiment with potentially disastrous consequences.
So they're advocating for caution.
Yeah, like proceed with extreme caution.
Right. We don't want to unleash some kind of Frankenstein food.
But the other speaker has a more nuanced perspective.
Okay.
They acknowledge the potential risks.
Yeah.
But they also highlight the potential benefits.
Like what?
things like increased crop yields, resistance to pests and diseases, and even the possibility of enhancing the nutritional value of crops.
So they're saying GMOs could actually help us.
Yeah. They see them as a potential solution.
To what?
To global hunger.
Okay.
You know, a way to feed a growing population in a world with a changing climate.
So they're framing it as a moral imperative.
Right. Like we have a responsibility to use all the tools at our disposal to address these challenges.
To feed the world.
Exactly.
That's a powerful argument.
It is. And it really highlights this tension between caution and innovation.
Yeah.
You know,
do we stick with what we know?
Right.
Or do we embrace new technologies?
Even if there are risks involved. And that tension runs throughout their whole conversation.
I haven't seen that.
Okay, so we've talked about declining birth rates.
Yeah.
Attacks on agriculture.
Right.
Potential for famine.
Scary stuff.
And then they take this really unexpected turn.
What do you mean?
They go from the material to the spiritual.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
They start talking about what they call the soul-crushing nature of modern life.
Wow. Okay, that took a turn.
Yeah. They're basically saying that all the pressures of modern society, you know, things like long working hours, economic insecurity, the constant barrage of information stimulation.
Yeah, it's like we're always on.
Exactly.
We never get a break.
And they argue that this is taking a toll on our well-being.
Yeah. I could see that.
Like our mental and physical health.
So they're connecting this to,
the rise of anxiety and depression.
Exactly. They see it as this creeping sense of burnout, alienation, and despair.
Like a spiritual crisis.
Yeah. And they even suggest that this spiritual malaise is contributing to the decline in birth rates.
Oh, wow.
And the erosion of traditional values.
Okay, so they're linking this to a broader cultural decline.
Exactly.
It's like they're saying that we've lost our way.
Yeah, and they seem to be longing for a simpler time.
Yeah.
You know?
Like a time when people were more connected to their communities and their faith.
Exactly. And they tie this directly to the rise of atheism and secularism.
Okay.
One of them argues that religion provides a moral compass and a sense of community.
Okay.
And that its absence has left a void in many people's lives.
So they're saying that we need something to believe in.
And they suggest that this loss of faith has contributed to moral relativism.
Okay.
And a weakening of traditional values.
So they're drawing a connection between
secularism and societal decay.
Exactly. They see it as slippery slope.
Yeah, a loss of moral grounding leading to all sorts of social problems.
It's a pretty controversial argument.
It is.
Especially in today's world.
Right, where secularism is becoming more and more prevalent.
And then they jump right into another controversial topic.
Which is?
Political correctness.
Oh, boy.
You can just imagine
how
this plays out.
I can only imagine. Lay it on me.
So one of them argues that political correctness has gone way too far.
Okay.
They say it's stifling free speech.
Yeah.
And creating a culture of fear and self-censorship.
So people are afraid to say what they really think for fear of offending someone.
They see it as a form of thought policing.
Right. Like you can't even express certain ideas without being labeled a bigot or a hater.
And they argue that this is actually harmful to society.
Okay, how so?
They say that open and honest dialogue is essential for a healthy society.
Right. So they're saying that even if it makes people uncomfortable, we need to be able to have these difficult conversations.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see that point.
Right.
But what about the other speaker?
The other speaker acknowledges that political correctness can sometimes go too far.
Okay.
But they also defend the importance of sensitivity and respect in public discourse.
Especially in today's world, where social media can amplify offensive speech so quickly and to such a wide audience.
So they're saying that we need to be mindful of the impact our words have on others.
Right.
Particularly those who have historically been marginalized.
So it's about balancing freedom of speech with the need to protect vulnerable groups.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is.
And these speakers are really wrestling with it.
I can see that.
Okay, so that's political correctness.
Yeah.
And then they move on to climate change.
Oh boy, that's a hot topic.
It is. And surprise, surprise, they don't exactly see eye to eye.
Okay, so lay it on me. What are their views?
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we left off with this pretty intense debate about political correctness and where to draw that line between freedom of speech and protecting people from harmful language.
It's a tough one.
It is. And they don't stop there.
Oh boy, what's next?
Next up is climate change.
Okay, so buckle up.
And you can probably guess.
Yeah.
They don't exactly see eye to eye on this one either.
Of course not. So what are their takes?
Okay, so one of them is super skeptical about the whole idea of human-caused climate change.
Really?
They basically call it a hoax.
Wow, okay, that's pretty extreme.
Yeah, they say that the science is not settled. And they think that the whole climate change movement is driven by ideology.
More than actual science.
Exactly.
So they're not buying the whole climate crisis narrative.
Nope. And they argue that policies aimed at reducing carbon emissions are actually going to do more harm than good.
Okay, so
they say it's going to cripple the economy.
Right.
And hurt the very people they're supposed to help.
Like a regressive tax.
Exactly.
Where the costs are passed on to consumers.
And they're really concerned about the impact on developing countries.
Okay.
They argue that these countries need access to cheap and reliable energy to lift themselves out of poverty.
And they see fossil fuels as the best way to do that.
Right. They're not convinced that renewable energy can meet those needs.
Okay, so they're pro-fossil fuels.
They are.
What about nuclear power?
They're actually big proponents of nuclear power.
Interesting.
They see it as a safe and efficient way to generate electricity.
And they argue that it's a much better option than renewables.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the other speaker?
The other speaker is a staunch believer in the science of climate change.
Okay.
They say the evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And they point to things like rising sea levels, more extreme weather events, and melting glaciers as proof that climate change is real. And it's happening now.
And they attribute this to human activity.
They do. They say that we're pumping too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Right.
And that's causing the planet to warm up.
And they argue that we need to take drastic action to reduce our emissions.
They do. Yeah. They see it as a moral imperative.
Right. Like we have a responsibility to future generations to leave them a habitable planet.
And they're very critical of the fossil fuel industry.
Okay.
They accuse them of spreading misinformation about climate change.
Yeah.
And they call for a rapid transition to renewable energy.
So they see solar and wind power as the solution.
Yes, and they believe that we have the technology and the resources to make this transition.
Okay, but what about the economic impact?
They argue that investing in renewable energy will actually create jobs and boost the economy.
So they're saying it's a win-win.
Exactly.
Both for the environment and the economy.
Right.
Interesting. So we've got two very different perspectives on climate change.
We do.
One skeptical, the other alarmed.
And advocating for urgent action.
Right. So where do they go from there?
Well, from there, they get into this discussion about the role of technology.
Okay.
And how it can be used to address some of these challenges.
Like climate change.
Yes. One of them is very optimistic about the potential of technology.
Okay.
They believe that we can innovate our way out of these problems.
Like a techno-utopian.
Kind of.
They see technology as the key to solving all our problems.
And they point to things like advances in renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology as evidence that we're on the right track.
So they're saying we just need to keep pushing forward with technological development.
Exactly.
And eventually we'll find solutions to all these challenges.
But the other speaker is more cautious.
Okay.
They warn against putting too much faith in technology. They say that technology is a tool.
Right.
And it can be used for good or for bad.
It depends on who's wielding it.
Exactly. And they argue that we need to be very careful about how we develop and deploy new technologies.
So they're saying we need to think about the ethical implications.
Yes, and the potential unintended consequences.
Right, because technology can have both positive and negative effects.
And they stress the importance of human values and wisdom in guiding technological development.
So it's not just about what we can do, but also about what we should do.
Exactly.
So it's a question of values.
And then from there, they have this fascinating discussion about human nature itself.
Oh, wow.
One of them argues that humans are inherently selfish and short-sighted.
That's a pretty cynical view.
It is.
It's humanity.
And they say that this makes it really difficult to address long-term challenges like climate change.
Because it requires cooperation and sacrifice.
Exactly.
Which is hard for selfish people.
They're basically saying that we're doomed by our own nature.
Wow. That's bleak.
But the other speaker pushes back on that.
Okay.
They argue that humans are also capable of great compassion and altruism.
So they're saying that we have the potential for both good and bad.
Exactly. And they believe that our capacity for cooperation and empathy gives us hope for the future.
So they're more optimistic about human nature.
They are. They believe that we can overcome these challenges if we work together.
That's a more hopeful message.
It is. And then they wrap things up with a discussion about what we can actually do.
To make a difference.
To make a difference.
Yeah.
One of them emphasizes individual action.
Okay.
They say that we all have a responsibility to make changes in our own lives.
Like what?
Things like reducing our consumption, eating less meat, driving less.
Okay, recycling more.
So all the things we can do to reduce our environmental impact.
They argue that if enough people make these changes, it can have a real impact.
Like a collective effort?
But the other speaker argues that individual action is not enough.
Okay.
They say that we need systemic change.
Okay. What does that mean? So they're talking about things like changing our energy systems.
Right.
Our transportation systems, our agricultural system.
Okay.
They argue that these systems are fundamentally unsustainable.
Okay.
And that we need to transform them.
So they're calling for a more radical approach?
They are.
Yeah.
They're saying that we need to move beyond individual actions and focus on changing the structures that shape our society.
So it's about changing the rules of the game.
Exactly. And they both agree that this is going to require a lot of work and a lot of collaboration.
Right.
But they also express a sense of hope.
Okay.
They believe that we can create a better future.
If we work together.
If we're willing to make the necessary changes.
So it's a call to action.
It is. Wow, that was a lot.
It was.
But so fascinating.
It really makes you think.
It does. And it shows that even people who disagree on some pretty fundamental issues can still have a productive conversation.
Right, and learn from each other.
Exactly. Well, that's it for this deep dive.
Thanks for taking us on that journey.
I hope you found it as thought-provoking as I did.
I did.
And I encourage you to keep thinking about these issues.
Yeah.
And to have your own conversations about them with your friends and family.
Absolutely. These are important things to talk about.
Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube.
We're here to make things clear.